Ever see a sailing ship, let alone sail on one. And I've been fortunate in sailing on a number, and Australia own probably at least a dozen sailing ships around the Australian coast now that are operating, different replicas, etc. And America are building replicas all the time.
With the first Australian settlers established close to the coast, what was in the heart of Australia was a tantalising mystery. And at a time when explorers discovering strange new lands were heroes, it was only natural several expeditions were sent out to map the unknown parts of Australia. Because all the known rivers flowed to the sea and birds were seen migrating towards the interior, the theory was there must be a great inland sea in the middle of the continent. Several explorers set forth and discovered routes to the interior which others would later follow, but realised the great inland sea was nothing but a myth. The most famous and the most tragic explorers were Burke and Wills, who walked across Australia from south to north but died on their way back to a base camp in the desert. Their deaths emphasised how harsh and how dangerous the deserts of Australia could be, but the route they took was followed later by settlers looking for grazing land. It's not commonly known there are still unexplored parts of Australia in the north of Western Australia, in what's called the Kimberley area. This is truly Australia's last frontier. Europeans have been here for only 50 years, and former cattle stations like El Questro, which cover 1 million acres, have places on it which are unknown. Zach Dragic is the last of a kind. He's a professional explorer who loves going where no man has gone before.
I mean, it's a very difficult question when people ask me, what do you actually do, what's your job? And you tell them you're an explorer. A lot of people believe that that particular employment ceased many years ago, hundreds of years ago, or at least 100 years ago. But in actual fact, in particular in the Kimberley region, there are still a lot of areas that haven't been explored. A lot of areas.
On El Questro too?
In particular on the El Questro property, there are areas that are just too rugged, just extremely rugged, and people haven't walked over there at all. I mean, unless you had a very good solid reason. And one of these reasons are to go out there and find new and beautiful natural attractions that haven't been found ever before. I mean, they've been mapped, but nobody can tell you exactly how it is until you get there and exert the physical expense that's required to get there.
Does it still surprise you?
Oh, it does, every time. Every time I come across a new waterhole or a gorge, it's always a beautiful experience. They're never the same, ever. That feeling that you get once you finally reach the destination after a few days walking in the heat, and you see the water sitting there in the gorge with its escarpments, its tropical vegetation. It's a feeling that cannot be, just can't be described. You actually have to do it.
Before railway lines were constructed, the bullock teams were the only way to move heavy cargo and machinery across the land. But bullock teams were not suited for Australia's hot and dry desert conditions. Imported camels were, and their drivers from India and Afghanistan, commonly called GANs for short, were important in opening up remote parts of Australia. The camels were the only ones capable of going ahead with materials to build the railway lines which later replaced them. Set free in the desert, they've thrived ever since. Now the camel has made a comeback as transport for tourists.
We went out, caught these from the wild, and I've broken them in. 20 odd years of horse breaking experience probably helped in that matter.
Are they descendants of the original camels?
They're descendants of the original camels. There's only ever about 10,000 camels ever imported to Australia, and we probably import close to that number a year back to Saudi Arabia.
These would be highly prized in Saudi Arabia.
Well, the fact is, Australia's got the only wild dromedaries left in the world, and through the natural process of the strongest bulls do all the breeding, we haven't got the inbreeding problems like they have over in Asia, so naturally ours are the better sought after camels.
In the steps of the explorers, some settlers tried to farm dry areas like the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, which at first looked promising. But droughts, which could last years at a time, drove almost all of them off the land. However, there were many success stories, as huge areas suitable for grazing were opened up, like the Great Western Plains on the western side of the Great Dividing Range. This land attracted a rich class called squatters, who left England already wealthy and established enormous cattle and sheep properties. They sailed to Australia with their own stock and tradesmen, so that even on the outback they could build rambling homesteads. Although large verandas gave their buildings an Australian feel, inside there was much to remind the squatters of their homeland. The main difference was the size of their properties, larger than many of the estates owned by aristocrats in England. The paddocks were often measured in square miles instead of acres. During the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, the world was short of wool, and Australia became a major supplier. A popular but very true saying was born: the Australian economy rides on the sheep's back. In recent times that has changed, although wool is still an important industry. On the land, stockmen known as drovers developed legendary skills to guide cattle incredible distances across a vast land to developing markets. These became the romantic heroes of Australia and are nostalgically held in high regard to this day. They were praised in much of Australian literature and poetry.
If the cattle broke from the sleeping camp, over the flats and across the plain, with my head bent down on his waving mane, through the boughs above and the stumps below, on the darkest night I could let him go at a racing speed. He would choose his course, and my life was safe with the old grey horse.
The stockmen were portrayed as tough but honest characters, superb horsemen, used to overcoming overwhelming odds, at home in the outback, and always out of place in the city. No matter where you go in country areas of Australia, the spirit of the stockman lives on. The longest river in Australia, the Murray, winds its way from the mountains of the Great Dividing Range, and on its path to the sea becomes the state boundary between New South Wales and Victoria. Now, compared to other rivers around the world, the Murray doesn't carry a large volume of water, but it does flow thousands of kilometres. It is joined by the Darling and Murrumbidgee rivers, which in turn flow from tributaries in the north and centre. As the southeast corner of the continent opened up, the Murray-Darling river system became a water highway to reach the interior. The eucalyptus red gums growing on the riverbanks were an ideal fuel for boilers. And this created the birth of the paddle boat era. Unlike the paddle steamers on the Mississippi River in America, which had one large paddle on the stern, Australian boats were sidewinders, a paddle on each side, giving more manoeuvrability.